Hello, my fear seekers. I'm your fear master. The darkness has set in, and the world outside has fallen silent. As you get comfortable in your refuge, let my voice guide you through several stories that explore the darkest corners of the imagination. Here, in the safety of your bed, you're protected from the fears that await. So before you turn off the lights and let the unknown wrap around you, take a moment to drop a comment and share where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. These are tonight's horror stories. Growing up in Louisiana, the bayou was practically our playground. My friends and I spent countless days exploring the murky waters, fishing, and just getting lost in the wild beauty of it all. There was something magical about the bayou, a place where time seemed to stand still, where the outside world didn't matter. But there was also something mysterious about it. Something that made your skin tingle when you were out there alone. It was late summer, and a group of us had decided to head out for a weekend camping trip deep in the bayou. We had done it before, but this time felt different. The air was thick with humidity, and the usual sounds of the swamp, croaking frogs, buzzing insects, felt muted, as if the whole place was holding its breath. We set up camp near a small clearing surrounded by cypress trees, their long draping moss swaying in the breeze. The water was calm, almost too calm, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the swamp, making it hard to tell where the land ended and the water began. We built a fire, cooked up some catfish we'd caught earlier, and settled in for a night of telling ghost stories and joking around. As the night wore on, the usual chatter died down, and a heavy silence fell over the camp. It wasn't unusual for the bayou to get quiet, but this was different. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, making it hard to breathe. My friend Joey was the first to break the tension. "Y'all hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all stopped talking and listened. At first I didn't hear anything, but then it came. A faint rustling, like something moving through the brush. It was slow, deliberate, and getting closer. "It's probably just a gator," I said, trying to sound confident, but even I didn't believe it. The rustling grew louder, and then through the flickering light of the fire, we saw it. A massive dark figure emerged from the trees, its shape barely visible in the shadows. It was huge, much larger than any animal we'd ever seen in the bayou, and its fur was so black it seemed to absorb the light. We all froze, unable to move or even breathe as the creature stood there, watching us. Its eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light, and for a moment I thought I could see a flicker of intelligence behind them, something almost human. Joey was the first to speak, his voice trembling. That's Bigfoot." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was crazy, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew he was right. This was no ordinary animal. It was something else, something ancient and powerful that didn't belong in our world. The creature took a step forward, and that was all it took to snap us out of our daze. We grabbed whatever we could, flashlights, knives, anything, and stood our ground, too scared to run but too terrified to stay put. The air was thick with fear, and the only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and disappeared back into the trees, its massive form melting into the shadows. We stood there for what felt like hours, too stunned to move, until finally someone suggested we pack up and leave. We didn't need any convincing. We threw everything into the boat and paddled out of there as fast as we could, not daring to look back. The ride back was silent. The only sound, the soft splash of the paddles in the water and the distant call of a night bird. When we finally reached the safety of the dock, none of us spoke about what had happened. It was like we had all agreed, without saying a word, that this was something we didn't want to remember. But I know we all felt the same thing. That the bayou wasn't just a place of beauty and mystery anymore. It was a place of fear. A place where something dark and unknown still roamed, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to stumble into its territory. I've always enjoyed late-night drives. There's something peaceful about the empty roads, the way the world feels like it's holding its breath in the darkness. But after that night on the highway, I don't think I'll ever feel the same way about driving alone at night again. It was a few years ago, and I was on my way back home from a weekend trip to visit some friends in a neighboring state. The drive was long, and the highway was a stretch of seemingly endless asphalt cutting through the rural Midwest. I had left my friend's place a bit later than I intended, and by the time I hit the highway, it was already well past midnight. The road was deserted, just me and my old pickup truck rolling along under the starless sky. The only light came from my headlights, illuminating the stretch of road ahead and the occasional road sign. I wasn't in a hurry, so I kept a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. About an hour into the drive, something caught my eye. On the side of the road, just at the edge of my headlight's reach, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a deer, common enough in these parts, but as I got closer, I realized something was off. It was too tall, too thin, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. The creature stepped onto the road, and I slowed down, trying to get a better look. It was like a deer, but twisted somehow, with elongated limbs and a face that wasn't quite right. Its eyes reflected the light from my headlights, glowing with an eerie intensity. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, a deep sense of dread washing over me as I realized it wasn't just standing there. It was looking directly at me. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, and my instincts screamed at me to get out of there. I pressed down on the accelerator, the truck lurching forward as I tried to put some distance between me and whatever that thing was. But as I sped down the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it start to move. It wasn't running, not exactly. The way it moved was more like a glide, its limbs bending in ways that didn't make sense. And it was fast, faster than anything that should have been able to keep up with my truck. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed the pedal to the floor, the engine roaring in response. The creature was right behind me now, close enough that I could see its distorted reflection in the side mirrors. Its eyes never left mine, locked in a gaze that felt like it was boring into my soul. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating, as I struggled to keep control of the truck. I swerved, trying to shake it off, but it was relentless. No matter how fast I drove, no matter how many turns I took, it stayed right on my tail, as if it was toying with me. The highway stretched on, a never-ending ribbon of fear and adrenaline, and I began to wonder if I would ever escape. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature veered off the road. It disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone on the highway, my heart still racing, and my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. I didn't slow down. I kept driving until I saw the lights of a small town up ahead, a beacon of safety in the darkness. When I finally pulled into the gas station at the edge of town, I sat in the truck for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I never did figure out what that creature was. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, and I hoped to never see it again. But every time I'm out on the road late at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. Growing up on a ranch in Montana, I always felt like I had a special connection to the land. The vast open spaces, the endless sky, and the quiet solitude were all things I took for granted as a kid. My family had been ranchers for generations, and I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. But one summer night, that sense of connection was shattered by something I still struggled to explain. It was a warm evening in late July. My dad had suggested we take the horses out for a night trail ride, something we hadn't done in a while. My mom, my younger brother Sam, and I all saddled up just as the sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and wild flowers. It was one of those perfect Montana nights that made you feel lucky to be alive. We rode out into the foothills, following a familiar path that wound through the forest and up to a small clearing that offered a stunning view of the valley below. The horses were calm, and we chatted easily as we rode, enjoying the coolness of the evening after the heat of the day. As we reached the clearing, the last light of day faded, and the stars began to appear one by one. My dad started a small campfire, and we settled in to enjoy the quiet night. The crackling of the fire and the occasional call of a night bird were the only sounds that broke the silence. After a while, Sam wandered off to explore the edge of the clearing, his curiosity getting the better of him. My mom and I stayed by the fire while my dad tended to the horses. Everything seemed peaceful, just another perfect night in the Montana wilderness. Then out of nowhere, the horses started to get restless. They pawed at the ground, their ears twitching, as if they sensed something in the darkness. My dad tried to calm them, but they were spooked, eyes wide with fear. The atmosphere shifted, the air growing colder, and I felt a sudden unease settle over me. That's when we heard it, a low guttural growl coming from the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, but not human either. My heart began to race, and I could see the fear in my mom's eyes as she grabbed my arm. My dad, always the calm and collected one, told us to stay close as he tried to see what was out there. Sam came running back to the fire, his face pale. "Something's out there," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I saw something moving in the trees." Before my dad could respond, we all saw it. A tall, shadowy figure emerged from the forest, its movements slow and deliberate. It was human-like in shape, but there was something wrong with it, something unnatural. It was too tall, too thin, and its eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light. We all froze, unable to move as the creature slowly made its way toward us. The horses were on the verge of bolting, and I could feel my own fear rising to a breaking point. My dad grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it out in front of him, as if trying to ward off whatever this thing was. For a moment, the creature stopped, its eyes fixed on the fire. Then it let out a roar that sent the horses into a frenzy. My dad shouted for us to get on our horses, and we scrambled to obey. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the reins, but somehow I managed to climb into the saddle. We took off at a gallop, the horses tearing through the underbrush as if they were being chased by the devil himself. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of what I might see. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of fear and adrenaline, the sound of pounding hooves and the wind in my ears drowning out everything else. When we finally reached the safety of the ranch, we dismounted, breathing heavily. My dad quickly ushered us into the house, locking the doors behind us. No one said a word as we sat in the kitchen, still trying to process what had just happened. We never spoke about that night again. My dad insisted it was just a bear or maybe a mountain lion, something explainable, something that could be reasoned away. But I knew better. I saw the look in his eyes, the fear he tried to hide. Whatever we encountered that night, it wasn't any animal I've ever seen. To this day, I can't explain what we saw out there in the darkness, but I know it changed me. The Montana wilderness, which had always felt like home, now held a darkness I couldn't ignore. And every time I'm out on those trails, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to get away from the noise and chaos of city life and find some solace in nature. When I rented the secluded cabin in the mountains of North Carolina, I was looking forward to a week of solitude, surrounded by nothing but trees, fresh air, and the distant sound of a babbling creek. Little did I know that peace would be shattered by something far more sinister. The first few days were exactly what I had hoped for. I spent my time hiking through the dense woods, reading on the porch, and just letting myself relax. The cabin was old, but well-maintained, and it had a certain charm that made me feel at home right away. The nearest town was miles away, and I loved the isolation. No phone calls, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. But as the days went on, I started to notice strange things. It began with small, almost unnoticeable details. The birdsong that had been so constant seemed to stop abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its place. The air, once fresh and crisp, began to feel heavy, as if a storm was brewing, even though the sky remained clear. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch, I noticed something unusual at the edge of the tree line. It was a circle of stones, arranged with deliberate precision, almost like a small altar. I hadn't seen it before, and it looked out of place, almost unnatural in the otherwise wild landscape. Curious, I walked over to inspect it more closely. The stones were smooth, worn by time, and in the center, there was a small mound of earth, freshly turned. As I stood there, a chill ran down my spine. There was something about the place that felt wrong, like I was intruding on something ancient and powerful. I decided to leave it alone, telling myself it was probably just an old site from the local Cherokee tribe that had once lived in these mountains. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside the cabin, strange, unidentifiable sounds that made my skin crawl. At first I thought it was just animals, but the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic, as if they were part of some kind of ritual. The air inside the cabin felt thick, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning I found something disturbing. The circle of stones had been disturbed, the earth in the center now dug up, and there were strange markings in the soil. Symbols I didn't recognize, but that filled me with a deep sense of unease. It was as if someone, or something, had performed a ritual there during the night. I decided it was time to leave, but when I tried to pack up, I found myself feeling dizzy and disoriented. It was like the cabin itself didn't want me to go. I struggled to focus, my thoughts muddled as I tried to gather my things. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the noises outside had grown louder, more insistent. As I stepped outside, I saw it. A figure at the edge of the woods, just beyond the stone circle. It was tall, its body covered in dark, matted fur, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light of the early morning. It wasn't human, but it wasn't fully animal either. Something in between, something born of the forest and the ancient rituals that had taken place there. The creature stood still, watching me, and I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. I knew I had to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear and the sheer presence of whatever this thing was. Finally, with every ounce of strength I could muster, I forced myself to move. I ran to my car, the creature's eyes following my every step. I could feel it watching me as I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The car finally roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of the nearest town. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something far worse than I could ever have imagined. Whatever that creature was, it was tied to the rituals and the land in a way I couldn't comprehend, and I had unwittingly disturbed something that should have been left alone. I never returned to that cabin, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone. But the memory of that creature, of those glowing eyes, haunts me to this day. It's a reminder that some places hold ancient secrets, and some rituals are better left undisturbed. I've always considered our home a safe haven, a place where nothing bad could ever happen. It's a modest house, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of Michigan, surrounded by friendly neighbors and tall, protective trees. We've lived here for years without any issues, until the night the shadow appeared. It started off innocently enough, just a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye as I walked down the hallway late one night. I chalked it up to being tired and thought nothing more of it. But over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent. It was always the same, a dark, shadowy figure, just on the edge of my vision, slipping around corners and disappearing before I could get a good look. I didn't mention it to my wife or kids at first. I didn't want to scare them, and I wasn't even sure what I was seeing. But as the days passed, I could tell they were starting to notice something too. My wife, Jessica, seemed jumpier than usual, and the kids refused to go to bed without a light on. One night, as we were settling in for bed, Jessica grabbed my arm. Her voice was shaky as she told me she had seen something moving outside our window. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was probably just a tree branch or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next evening, as I was locking up the house, I saw it clearly for the first time. A tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of our backyard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. My heart raced as I quickly locked the door and pulled the curtains closed. I didn't sleep that night, and I'm pretty sure Jessica didn't either. From that point on, the shadow became a nightly presence. It would appear just after dusk, lurking around the house, peering in through windows and slipping around corners. No matter how much I tried to catch it, it would always vanish before I could get close. The fear in our house was palpable. The kids started having nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. Jessica and I grew more paranoid, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. We kept the lights on as much as possible, but even that didn't seem to keep the shadow away. One particularly dark night, as a storm raged outside, the shadow made its boldest move yet. We were all in the living room, huddled together with the TV on for background noise. Suddenly the lights flickered and the TV went out, plunging us into darkness. Before I could react, I saw it. The shadow, now inside the house, moving across the wall towards us. Panic set in. I grabbed Jessica's hand and yelled for the kids to get behind me. The shadow continued to move closer, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. I could feel a coldness in the air, a deep sense of dread that made my skin crawl. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. Just as the shadow seemed to reach us, the lights flickered back on. The shadow vanished, leaving nothing but an icy chill in the room. We didn't know what to do. We were terrified, but there was no one we could call, no one who would believe us. That night, we made the decision to leave the house. We packed what we could and drove to a hotel, leaving the shadow and whatever else was lurking behind us. We haven't been back since. To this day, I can't explain what that shadow was or why it chose our home. We've moved to a new place far from that house, but the memory of those nights still haunts us. I've heard stories of shadow people, of dark entities that feed off fear, but I never thought I'd encounter one myself. All I know is that whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't welcome in our home. Family vacations were always something I looked forward to. There's nothing like getting away from the hustle and bustle of daily life and spending some quality time with loved ones. This year we decided to rent a cabin in the woods, nestled deep in the mountains of Colorado. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to relax and reconnect. But what we found in those woods turned our vacation into a nightmare. The cabin was perfect, rustic, isolated, and surrounded by towering pine trees. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. We spent our days hiking, fishing, and exploring the area, enjoying the tranquility that only nature can provide. On the third day of our stay, we decided to venture further into the woods, hoping to find a stream we had read about online. The trail wasn't marked, but we were confident we could find our way. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, and the light from the sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy above. It was my youngest son who first spotted it, a large gaping pit in the ground, hidden among the underbrush. The edges of the pit were jagged, as if the earth had been violently torn open. The pit was deep, and when we peered over the edge, we couldn't see the bottom. A strange, musty odor wafted up from the darkness below, making us all wrinkle our noses. At first, we were curious. My husband suggested it might be an old well or a sinkhole, but something about the pit didn't seem natural. The earth around it was dry and cracked, and there were no signs of water or vegetation. It was as if the land itself had been poisoned. Despite our unease, we decided to leave it alone and continued our hike. But as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods, which had been so peaceful just moments before, now felt oppressive, as if the trees themselves were closing in on us. That night, as we sat around the campfire, the mood was different. The usual laughter and chatter were replaced by an uneasy silence. My husband kept glancing over his shoulder, and the kids stayed close to the fire, their eyes wide and nervous. I tried to brush it off as fatigue from the day's hike, but deep down, I knew it was something more. It wasn't until later that night, after we had all gone to bed, that the terror truly began. I was awakened by a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. It was followed by a series of loud thuds, as if something heavy was moving through the woods. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The thuds grew louder, closer, and I realized they were coming from the direction of the pit. Then I heard it. A guttural growl, so deep and primal that it sent a shiver down my spine. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the yard, but I could see something moving in the trees, something big. I rushed to wake my husband, and we both stood at the window, watching in horror as a massive, hulking figure emerged from the woods. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. A monstrous creature, covered in matted fur, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the night. It was heading straight for the cabin. Panic set in. We gathered the kids and barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, praying that the creature wouldn't be able to break through. The thuds grew louder as it approached the cabin, followed by the sound of wood splintering as it clawed at the walls. The growls were deafening, a terrifying reminder of the thing that was just outside, trying to get in. We huddled together, trembling with fear, as the creature continued its assault on the cabin. It felt like hours before the noises finally stopped, and the silence returned. We waited, too scared to move, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. When we finally dared to leave the room, the cabin was in shambles. The front door was nearly ripped off its hinges, and deep gouges marred the walls. But the creature was gone, leaving only destruction in its wake. We didn't waste any time packing up and getting out of there. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin, half expecting to see the creature watching us from the trees. But the woods were still, and the only sign of life was the sun rising over the mountains. To this day, I don't know what that creature was or what it wanted, but I do know one thing. Whatever it was, it came from that cursed pit in the woods. We were lucky to escape with our lives, and I'll never go back to those mountains again. Camping alone has always been something I've enjoyed. There's a unique sense of peace that comes from being completely alone in nature, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of the forest. But after what happened during my last solo trip, I'm not sure I'll ever feel that same sense of peace again. It was early fall, and I had decided to spend the weekend camping in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I had found a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any other campsites or trails. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, and a little bit eerie, just the way I liked it. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what I expected to be a relaxing few days. The first night passed without incident. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire, enjoyed the clear night sky, and eventually drifted off to sleep to the soothing sounds of the forest. But the second night was different, very different. I had just finished dinner and was sitting by the fire when I started to notice the woods around me growing unnervingly quiet. The usual chorus of crickets and night birds had stopped, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I sat there, trying to brush off the growing sense of unease, I heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush, just beyond the light of the fire. I strained my ears, trying to figure out what it was. A deer, maybe, a raccoon, but the rustling grew louder, closer, and I realized it wasn't just an animal moving through the woods. It was deliberate, like something or someone was circling my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The beam of light only seemed to make the shadows deeper, more menacing. The rustling continued, moving from one side of the campsite to the other, just out of sight. My heart began to race, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing out there. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the trees to my left. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a deep, primal noise that sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I stood up, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the trees, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing but the darkness and the feeling of being watched. For what felt like hours, I stood there, frozen in place, listening to the growls and rustling that seemed to move all around me. I knew I should get back to the tent, get my things, and leave. But my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, trapped by the unseen presence in the woods. Finally, the noises stopped, as suddenly as they had begun. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, a suffocating quiet that made the darkness feel like it was closing in on me. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I backed away from the fire and made my way to the tent. I spent the rest of the night huddled inside, clutching my flashlight and listening to every sound outside. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I don't know how I made it through the night without losing my mind. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and left that campsite as quickly as I could. I didn't care about breakfast or breaking down the fire. I just wanted to get out of those woods. As I hiked back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. To this day, I don't know what was out there that night. I've told myself it was just an animal, maybe even a bear, but deep down, I know it was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. I haven't been camping alone since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. Our family vacations were always about getting away from the hustle and bustle of city life, finding peace and quiet in nature. That year, we decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods of northern Minnesota. The idea was to spend a week disconnected from the world. No phones, no internet, just us and the great outdoors. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. But what we encountered out there turned our peaceful getaway into a nightmare I'll never forget. The cabin was nestled deep in the forest, far from any main roads or towns. It was a cozy place, surrounded by towering pine trees, and with a crystal-clear lake just a short walk away. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows as it dipped behind the trees. My wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids, Emma and Jake, were just as excited as I was to start our adventure. The first few days were exactly what we had hoped for, fishing, hiking, and enjoying the stillness that only a place like this could offer. The kids loved exploring the trails around the cabin, their laughter echoing through the trees as they ran ahead. Evenings were spent around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories under a blanket of stars. It felt like the perfect escape, exactly what we needed. But on the fourth night, everything changed. It started with a noise, something that woke me in the middle of the night. At first I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but then I heard it again, a deep, guttural growl coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The growl came again, louder this time, and I could feel the vibrations through the walls. I got out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake Sarah or the kids. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the front window. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the moon peeking through the clouds. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I knew something was out there. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A massive, dark shape moving between the trees. It was huge, easily the size of a bear, but there was something off about it. Its movements were too deliberate, too controlled, and its eyes glowed with a faint, unnatural light. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. I had no idea what I was looking at, but I knew we were in danger. I rushed to wake Sarah, trying to stay calm so as not to scare the kids. "There's something outside," I whispered urgently. "We need to stay quiet and stay together." Sarah's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded, quickly getting out of bed. We moved the kids to the living room, keeping the lights off, hoping whatever was out there would lose interest and leave. But the growling grew louder, more insistent, and then came the sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I grabbed the shotgun we had brought along for protection, my hands shaking as I loaded it. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. But then, with a thunderous crash, the creature slammed into the side of the cabin, shaking the entire structure. The kids screamed, and I pulled them close, trying to shield them as the creature continued to batter the walls. It was trying to get in. I fired a shot through the window, hoping to scare it off, but all it did was make the creature angrier. It let out a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to rattle my very bones, and I knew we were out of time. "We need to get to the truck," I shouted, adrenaline taking over as I grabbed the keys. "Now!" We made a run for it, bursting through the front door and sprinting to the truck. The creature was right behind us, its footsteps thunderous on the ground. I could feel it closing in, its growls growing louder with every step. I shoved the kids into the back seat, Sarah diving in after them, and I jumped into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. We sped down the narrow dirt road, the creature's roars fading into the distance as we left the cabin behind. I didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, and even then I couldn't stop shaking. We never went back to that cabin. We didn't even go back to retrieve our things. Whatever that creature was, it had claimed that place, and I wasn't about to put my family in danger again. The vacation we had hoped for had turned into a nightmare, one that haunts me to this day. And every time I hear a growl in the night, I'm taken back to that cabin in the woods, to the night when something inhuman tried to break in. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to slow down just a bit, giving you time to appreciate the simple things. My backyard had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could unwind after a long day. The garden was particularly beautiful that summer, with the flowers in full bloom and the scent of fresh earth in the air. Little did I know that night would be anything but peaceful. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was a brilliant shade of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that makes you stop and take notice. As the light began to fade, I noticed something strange in the far corner of the garden. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the old oak tree. But as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, it became clear that it was something else entirely. There, perched on the stone wall that bordered the garden, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was roughly the size of a large bird, but its shape was all wrong. Its wings were leathery, not feathered, and they curled around its body like a bat. Its head was grotesque, with a twisted, almost human-like face, but with features that were far too sharp and angular to be anything human. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a gargoyle come to life. I froze, unable to move as I watched it. The creature didn't seem to notice me at first. It was just sitting there, staring into the garden, as if it was waiting for something. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I was seeing was real. After what felt like an eternity, the creature turned its head slowly, its eyes locking onto mine. They were dark, almost black, and filled with a malevolent intelligence. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that this thing wasn't just some mindless beast. It was something much worse, something aware. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then, without warning, it spread its wings wide, revealing a body that was both muscular and gaunt at the same time. It let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the air, and I knew I had to do something. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I didn't have any weapons, nothing that could defend me against whatever this thing was. My first instinct was to run back into the house, but some primal part of me knew that turning my back on it would be a mistake. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the garden hose and aimed it at the creature, spraying a jet of water in its direction. To my surprise, it worked. The creature screeched, a high-pitched sound that pierced the night, and took off into the air, disappearing into the darkness above. I stood there, panting, the hose still in my hand, half expecting it to come back. But the night remained silent, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. I knew what I'd seen was real, but who would believe me? A gargoyle in my garden? It sounded ridiculous even to me. The next morning, I checked the spot where the creature had been, hoping to find some kind of evidence. A footprint, a feather, anything to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But there was nothing. The garden looked as it always did, peaceful and undisturbed. I haven't seen the creature since, but the memory of that night stays with me. I still can't explain what it was or where it came from, but I do know one thing. I'll never look at my garden the same way again. I've always been drawn to the eerie beauty of swamps. There's something about the stillness, the thick, humid air, and the sense of ancient mystery that surrounds them that pulls me in. So when I had the chance to explore a remote swamp in Louisiana, I jumped at the opportunity. I wasn't prepared for what I would encounter. It was early spring when I set out, the air still cool but heavy with the scent of moss and decaying vegetation. The swamp was located far from any town, nestled deep in the bayou. I'd heard stories about the area, whispers of strange lights and ghostly figures seen moving through the mist, but I brushed them off as local legends meant to scare tourists. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the water as I made my way through the dense underbrush. The swamp was even more isolated than I had imagined, with towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss and the dark, murky water reflecting the twisted branches above. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, and I couldn't wait to explore. As I ventured deeper into the swamp, the air grew thicker, almost oppressive, and the usual sounds of wildlife seemed to fade away. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional splash of something moving in the water. I told myself it was just a fish, or maybe a frog, but there was an eerie stillness to the place that made me uneasy. I had been walking for about an hour when I noticed something strange. The light had begun to change, taking on an unnatural greenish hue. It filtered through the trees in a way that made the shadows seem to move and shift around me. I paused, looking around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the endless expanse of water and trees. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a faint, glowing figure moving through the mist. It was barely visible, just a wisp of light floating between the trees. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to get a better look, but the figure had already disappeared into the fog. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Could it have been a trick of the light? Or maybe my eyes playing tricks on me? But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. I decided to keep moving, telling myself that I had just imagined it. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air grew colder, and the mist thickened around me, making it harder to see the path ahead. The silence was oppressive, and I found myself straining to hear anything that would break it. A bird call, a rustle of leaves, anything. That's when I heard it, a soft, whispering sound, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but I still couldn't make out any words. They seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the trees and across the water. Panic began to set in. I turned to leave, but the path I had taken was no longer visible. The mist had swallowed it up, leaving me surrounded by a wall of gray. I was lost, trapped in the heart of the swamp with no way out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the presence of something, no, several somethings, moving into the mist. Shapes began to form, ghostly apparitions drifting through the fog, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were all around me, closing in, their whispers turning into low, guttural moans. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from whatever was out there. The ground was slick with mud, and I slipped more than once, my heart racing as I struggled to stay on my feet. The apparitions followed, their forms flickering in and out of sight as I pushed through the underbrush. Finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto a narrow dirt road. I collapsed, gasping for breath, and looked back at the swamp. The mist was still there, swirling around the trees, but the apparitions were gone. The whispers had faded, replaced by the distant sound of birds calling from the safety of the forest. I didn't waste any time. I got to my feet and hurried down the road, not stopping until I reached my car. I didn't look back as I drove away. The memory of those ghostly figures burned into my mind. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that swamp. I've heard stories of haunted places, of spirits that linger in places of tragedy, but I never believed them until now. I haven't been back to that swamp, and I don't plan to. Some places are better left alone, their secrets buried in the mist. Well, that's all for tonight. I hope you have sweet dreams, if you can sleep at all after that. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss any of our chilling stories. Be sure to tune in for our next terrifying episode. This is your Fear Master, signing off.